Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Anatol Lieven, Director of the Eurasia Programme here at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Before introducing today's webinar, I would just like to flag two upcoming Quincy events. Tomorrow at 3:30 p.m. EST, QI and Warhorse will be discussing new reporting from Warhorse, veteran correspondents, on the battle for Fallujah, which took place 20 years ago. And on Monday, the 25th, QI is holding an online conference on the report of our Better Order project on how to replace the so-called rules-based order. And this will feature several participants in the project. So I do hope you can attend those two events as well. For today, if you have questions, which I hope you do, please put them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, and I will pass as many of them as I can on to the participants. So for today, we are discussing an extremely topical subject, the political crisis in Germany, the snap elections. Snap elections hardly ever happen in Germany, and the implications of this and the reasons for it in the context of wider European developments and the war in Ukraine. Unfortunately, our third speaker, Christopher Lane, is ill and couldn't make it. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Molly O'Neill, who is a QI non-resident fellow and is the author of a QI policy brief, which has just come out on the risk to Germany and Europe from a prolonged war in Ukraine. And Matthias Mattis, who is the Dean Acheson Professor at SAIS and Senior Fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations, and an expert on political economy, international political policy, and regional integration, all of them very important topics for today. So to begin, Molly, perhaps you could tell us something about your policy brief and your views on how the war in Ukraine have affected developments in Germany and in Europe more widely.
Right. Well, this policy brief was published in October, and needless to say, events are moving ahead. But the basic claim of the paper was that the policy choice or strategic choice to pursue maximal aims for the Ukraine war, in other words, an unambiguous victory for Ukraine, seemed to be the course of action chosen at that time by Biden, and I certainly think it would have been pursued had the election gone otherwise. In any case, I argued that this policy carried with it evident risks for what I call the European peace order, by which I mean the capacity of Europe to act collectively and cooperatively, and as a group of liberal democracies, is something that the U.S. has fostered previously as a major element of its policy in the whole post-war era, and that we're seeing dangerous developments due in part, I claim, to the effects of the war in Ukraine, both on budgetary choices and the costs of supporting Ukraine, the economic slump that's at least attributable in part to the war in Ukraine, and then finally to the opportunities that this posed for illiberal or populist parties in Europe. And we can see this steady progress being made across a number of countries, as I'm sure we're all aware. And there have been quite a few articles that I've done and others have done in responsible statecraft covering this in recent months. So bringing the case down to Germany, we have, I also argued that it seemed to me that the post-conflict period would be one where we'd expect and need, and the Europeans would recognize the need to assume more of its own responsibility for more of its own conventional military deterrent. And that definitely has been very much a matter of discussion in Europe. But it's something that would require political coherent and stable governments, and in particular in the two principal countries that have driven the European integration process from its inception, and that's France and Germany. So already the article talked quite a bit about the political scene in Germany in particular. It didn't anticipate, of course, necessarily that the coalition would fall apart prematurely as it has done. And so that's what we're facing today. And I think I'm not saying that I'm totally vindicated in my argument, but I am saying that certainly the developments that we've seen now in the aftermath, especially as we're now facing a big transition also in the United States, point to the impact of the Ukraine war on domestic political trends in not only in Europe but also in the United States. So that's what I would say.
In Matthias, the precipitant of the collapse of the coalition was a battle over the budget and debt. How far, in your view, has this been driven by the additional demands of the war in Ukraine, funding Ukraine, and increasing military spending? And what are the implications of this, not just for Germany, but for other European countries which are also facing severe budgetary pressure?
Thank you, Anatol, and thanks for inviting me. It's great to be back at Quincy. So the genesis of this coalition, the traffic light coalition of the red Social Democrats, the Greens, and the yellow colored liberals, the compromise, if you want, the glue that made this quote unquote an exciting coalition was a few things. They had amazing support by young people, right? Roughly 30% of the young voted for the Greens, and another 30% voted for the FDP, right? Less so for the SPD, but the idea was that Scholz was going to lead a coalition from, the sort of center. He was going to be the glue between green and yellow, where the Greens were going to get their climate and their energy transition and the fight against climate change be put front and center. And the FDP, led by Finance Minister Christian Lindner, were going to see digitization, right? So young people wanted to see a modern economy that was at ease with renewable energy. And for Scholz, the main thing to protect was, of course, the social welfare state. And to some extent, also the old sort of German export-driven model. So if you recall, they came into office, I think, just exactly 3 years ago, early December 2021. And the Ukraine war immediately kind of overwhelmed this, because very quickly, the energy transition had to be speeded up by this cutoff from Russian oil and gas that was kind of forced on Germany. Right? This is not something they chose. This was something they were told to do. And then the pressure was so much that they decided this. And rather than talking about Nord Stream 2, they were talking about Nord Stream 1, right? And cutting that off in kind of a very fast-paced period. And for Lindner, the FDP, this was uncomfortable because suddenly they had to talk about a lot more spending, right? And what they really wanted was tax cuts. But given their obsession with keeping debt small, you couldn't have both. And for Scholz, it was very uncomfortable because, of course, his party had a legacy. I mean, it's after all the party of Willy Brandt, the party of Ostpolitik. They had a lot of people that were very close to Russia and valued that relationship. It was only just the Greens that kind of pushed forward on this and felt vindicated, right? And so the way this was always going to fall apart, and I mean, most German hands are still surprised that it did fall apart because Germans supposedly abhor instability, and they'd rather suffer through another year and wait for the election in September, is that there were these incompatible demands within the budget, right? And for Lindner, he already faced this moment a year ago, but then decided to kind of muddle through. But he wasn't willing to do another sort of, budgetary sleight of hand where the Ukraine money was going to be set aside out of the budgetary rules of the debt break, which is constitutional, which was put in place in response to the global financial crisis and the bank bailouts and so on. And now looks obviously foolish, even it was foolish at the time. And I mean, it really was the Ukraine war that's kind of massively upped the pressure, right? Because it's not just the fact that there's a lot more spending and there's this whole discussion about what should Germany do to support Ukraine. But there's the whole crumbling of the German model that rested on, you know, a kind of open world economy where the Americans, the Chinese, and the Russians were all happily buying German cars, right? And that is now coming under pressure from all three fronts.
In these circumstances, an observer from another planet might expect that leading German parties would wish to reduce at least one element of this pressure by trying to bring an end to the war in Ukraine. But there doesn't seem to be, I mean, obviously, there is a growing support for opponents of the war, but not, it would seem, in the German establishment. Matthias, what do you see that emerging?
I mean, I think it's obvious that Scholz himself wants to thread this needle, right? He wants to position himself as the Friedenskanzler, right? As the chancellor who will bring peace. He has seen the rise on both far left and far right, the support for the Bundesrat Wagenknecht, who's clearly, you know, in favor of ending the war in Ukraine and stopping the escalation that you've seen and that we just see in the last few days, even amping up further. And of course, the AfD on the right. Scholz knows that he can get votes back from them, right? A lot of SPD, traditional SPD voters have left them for the AfD, and now, of course, have left them for Sarah Wagenknecht's party. But there's a fight within the party, right? I mean, his big supposed challenger, who hasn't said as much, but that we're all waiting for. And remember, SPD will only have a party congress in January 11, I believe. So there's a lot that can happen between now and then, whether Scholz is even going to be the chancellor candidate. Right now, he looks like he will be it. But, you know, if the polls don't improve, it's not unthinkable that by January 11, they pull the plug. So in that sense, there is part of the German establishment that does want to settle it. But I think there's just such overwhelming pressure from the UK, from the Biden administration especially, and of course from the East, right, from Poland, from the Baltics, to not go that route. That Merz of the CDU has actually positioned himself as much more hawkish on this, right? He's promised that if Putin doesn't stop targeting civilian targets in Ukraine within 24 hours, he's going to authorize all kinds of weapons to be sent to Ukraine being used on Russian soil and so on. The Greens are clearly, that's where the Greens and the CDU get along, and that's where you could see a future coalition, but a coalition that's actually much tougher on Russia rather than the other way around. It's harder to see from an establishment point of view, you're absolutely right, a coalition emerge that wants to settle this. Of course, they can be taken in speed by Donald Trump, because that's the other awkward thing, right? They're going to have a 1 month long campaign right when Donald Trump comes to office, and you can only imagine every day how many new initiatives and how many things are going to happen in Washington, D.C.
Well, Molly, I'd like to ask you about that, because it is surprising to me as a Brit, looking at the British government, for example, which appears to be on the point of, if it hasn't already, of following Biden in authorizing Ukraine to fire British missiles guided by Americans into Russia. And yet, this is, you know, in the context of, I mean, not a lame duck, I mean, almost an ex-administration with a completely new administration coming to power. How do you think, Molly, that a Trump administration will, well, affect European policy? Will the Europeans, in the end, led by the Germans, bow to Trump policy on Ukraine, whatever it is? Or do you think we will see serious pushback against it?
Well, that is really a very interesting question. I would just note also that I wanted to just elaborate a little bit about Scholz kind of trying to refashion his appeal to voters by suggesting that he is a peace candidate. What this really amounts to is really two things. One is his firm refusal, once more, he's reiterated, to deliver these Taurus long-range missiles, which of course Merz says he will deliver when he will be the chancellor. And also the other small thing, that gesture that Scholz has made about peace is call to Putin, which of course caused a terrific amount of consternation in Europe. So these little gestures, I'm watching the polls daily. I don't see any uptick in the SPD polling from these gestures. But what it may be doing is helping Scholz to keep the more peace-oriented camp within SPD from ditching him and putting instead the defense minister, Boris Pistorius, an much more popular figure to lead the SPD's campaign. Pistorius isn't showing any willingness necessarily to do that right now, because a lot of people suggest that, right now CDU has about 33% of the voting intentions and SPD around 16. So the two of them together, in all likelihood, could form a coalition, and that is the most likely outcome from the election, in my opinion. It won't be a happy marriage. It'll be less harmonious than it was, for example, the same type of Grand Coalition under Merkel. But it seems to me to be the only outcome. I don't see, first of all, Greens are only at 11%. They're not growing either. They're, if anything, declining slightly in recent polling. I don't know where the recovery would come from. So alone, they wouldn't be enough to be together with the CDU. That wouldn't be 50%. And I think the government would, Merz, of course, would prefer to see the liberals come into their own again. That would be the perfect harmonious match. But liberals right now are only at a little under 5%. And so that's the threshold, 5%. So it's not, that probably is unworkable. So anyway, coming back to your question, though, about the consensus in Europe, it is very interesting. There does seem to be, like, the public mood is clearly shifting toward more recognition that the war should end by negotiation. There are many, many polls that show this across different European polities. And of course, I believe this is the reason why you've seen success by parties like AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's party in Germany, in these regional elections, as we talked about a lot back in the fall. So AfD is still second behind CDU, a distant second, with about 18% of the voting poll in the polls right now. But who knows, maybe they could surprise on the upside. It's not, Germany must be the most polled society in the world. I mean, there's numerous institutes every day checking the temperature. So it's hard to believe it's wrong, but we'll have to see how that emerges. But I would note that so right now, I just looking at what has gone on in the various meetings that have happened among the allied countries. And particularly, I'd like to point out there was a meeting of foreign ministers, the so-called Weimar group, which is Germany, Poland, and France. These three foreign ministers, plus the Italian, and I think they also had, I think somehow Zelensky involved, I'm not sure. But they actually came out, their communique is saying that they are going to insist on assuming the burden of full support for Ukraine, even if the U.S. cuts off military support. Well, I don't know. If you've examined the public finance picture, that is just a completely absurd proposition, but that is what they're saying. And so, but what they're saying, and they're sort of a get out of jail free card, is that there should be Euro bonds would be issued to make this happen, to relieve the resource constraint, allow a borrowing by the European Union, as was done under the COVID period. So the trouble with that is Merz would never go for that. That is definitely not happening as far as Germany is concerned. That he's very firm on this fiscal. He may release the fiscal break, but I don't see him agreeing to European funding. I don't know. Matthias may have a better idea than me. So right now, I don't know if this is a gambit, just to show a strong solidarity in order to get a seat at the table for Europe, because I think the Europeans are probably afraid that Trump is just going to make the deal without even asking them or consulting with them at all. So clearly they don't want that to happen. So I think there's a lot of disarray, basically. And again, the approach the Europeans are taking, the European leadership is taking, is very much to stay the course, and we can handle it. Wir schaffen das, or we're going to make this. We're going to make this work. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see what happens.
Europe in disarray, surely not. When I was in Paris and Berlin in the summer, some of the establishment French were saying, yes, we can take over full support for Ukraine, including militarily if America pulls out. I ran this past Germans, including establishment Germans, and they said, no, nonsense, maybe economically, but not militarily. But Matthias, what do you think about this? Are the Europeans essentially on autopilot over this? Or is this, as Molly suggests, perhaps purely declarative? Or, is there serious thinking going on in your view?
There is serious thinking, but there also is a bit of a leadership void, right? That in many ways, this starts with your own UK, Anatole. Unsurprisingly, Keir Starmer's big statement yesterday at the G20 was that he's going to steer a middle course between Trump's America and the EU, even though, of course, most of his voters would want closer relations with the EU and prioritize that over, doing a Faustian bargain with Trump's America. This is not what Labour voters are interested in. That said, he also knows he's going to be disappointed, right? Because the EU always pushes just a little bit too much on this stuff, and they run circles around the UK when it comes to negotiations, and they're going to want a lot of things like youth mobility schemes and all those things that are very symbolically important and that are going to cost the UK money, more money than they get out, and then that whole game starts all over again. So the UK naturally would have to lead such a coalition, but again, they're mistrustful of the EU. Germany is going through an election, so that won't be sorted. I don't know what you think, Molly, but realistically, a Chancellor Merz, assuming polls stay where they are, probably emerges in June, right? So we're still talking 6, 7. Maybe they can do it faster. Maybe it's May. But still, the deal may already be done in Ukraine. And Macron. Macron's moment was in 2017, right? And that's now 7, 8 years ago, and. He really is all consumed by the domestic fiscal battle, by solving the gap between 58% of outlays and 52% of revenues, and solving that by even higher taxes, right? Which I imagine most people who are listening to this conversation based in the US find, most Europeans find this already crazy, this high taxes, right? To raise it even further to solve a budget issue. So then you come at the Commission, right? Von der Leyen is the most experienced person now there. She's also gotten a lot more power. She's treated seriously at the White House, especially the Biden White House, but of course that's changing. But the EU can act, but does she have followers, right? As Molly said, I actually think you could see a Merz-led coalition with Greens and SPD, a two-thirds majority that then reforms the debt brake. Because they need a constitutional two-thirds majority for this. And then the deal will be, but this will be for Germany, right? We will borrow more to invest in the German economy, in the German energy transition, in German defense, but not to open the floodgates towards new EU borrowing, right? And they will hide behind the Dutch and the frugal 4 or 5, the Nordics that don't want this either. That said, what you say, Anatole, if you do see the Poles, the Baltics, and the Scandinavians together with the UK, that is a potential coalition of the willing, right? Maybe with support from the Commission. But I don't see the EU come up with a replacement for the US, because it would have to be the EU basically buying American weapons and paying for it. And that said, Trump could force their hand on this. But that's why I think, and your interactions with Berlin this summer are revealing there, right? That's why I think the Germans want this, rather have this settled. And then the question will be, what kind of security guarantees will Ukraine get in return?
Right.
Yes, indeed. And I mean, are the implications of all this that we are likely to see a further growth of the extremes in Europe? If these budgetary pressures continue, if migration pressures continue, and if the European Union acquires or is seen to acquire even more power, and of course these, well, actually not just the right-wing populist parties, increasingly the left-wing populist parties as well, do have a strong Eurosceptic element in their base. I mean, are we looking from that point of view as well, in your view, at a long-term European political crisis?
I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, it was one thing in 2017 for the Germans to tie their security fate to the French. Macron was just elected. There was a broad centrist movement. It was all pro-European. But who wants to tie their security fate to Marine Le Pen's France, right? I mean, it would be political suicide to want to do this. And that's, I mean, if you look at France, it's a real candidate for a far-right government in 2027 if current trends continue. It may not be Marine Le Pen. She may not be able to run.
Right.
But honestly, that's where the comparison with Trump and lawfare doesn't quite work. The French will accept this. They've had Sarkozy in jail and Fillon, and the establishment goes to jail there too, right? But there'll be Jordan Bardella or somebody younger who will be the standard bearer, and I think that will maybe even take some of the sting out of it. They look at Meloni in Italy, and they even look at the Netherlands, and these are two founding EU members, and the sky hasn't fallen, right, with the far right in power. So why not try it? But you do get the political crisis because there's going to be more and more opt-outs. Right? You already see this with the Dutch and immigration. We don't want to be part of this anymore. We don't want to be part of that anymore. And that's, I think, when you get the kind of slow erosion of the EU just by its founding member states who are no longer, kind of abiding by the acquis, right? In that sense, that's I think is the real risk. And I mean, I'd be interested to see what Molly thinks of this. But the question is, I mean, there was one poll that had Sarah Wagenknecht, the Linke, and the FDP all under 5%. Right? It's just been one poll. I don't want to extrapolate this, but it does mean that there is some volatility. I think this is going to get more volatile. There could be surprises. The Greens could do better. The AFD could do better. The SPD with another chancellor candidate could do better. The Merz could collapse, right? Because he's famously, volatile. So, I mean, it isn't over. That said, we also know that the CDU has been ahead for 2 years without any real move. So the campaign still has to be fought. But Molly, what do you think? Do you think this is good for the extremes?
Well,
in Germany?
I know what you're saying. I think what Merz said the other day, something that I think is probably true, which is that this was reported that he said that really the CDU, CSU needs to have liberals for a partner and only liberals for a partner. And if we can't get that, we are just going to reinforce the prospects of AFD eventually rising and being, it'd be impossible eventually if AFD continues to rise to exclude them permanently from ever being in any coalition. So he was saying that a condition for avoiding that was, in his mind, to have liberals rise enough to be the sole coalition partner, as was sort of like the good old days in stable Germany of the past. So I suppose that's probably a vain wish to try to hope for that to happen. But I know that they prefer not to have three parties the way it was done with Ampel. That proved to be, the traffic light coalition. That proved to be a very unstable, and so they don't want to replicate that. So I believe they're stuck with SPD. I don't think that they would form a coalition with Greens. I mean, Merz is very anti-Green. He doesn't really like their priorities very much, and so maybe their stranger things have happened. But anyway, So that's how I think about it. But you know, what I said in my paper was that this kind of disintegration that we're talking about, the vitiation of both the weakening and the realignment, whatever it is, in both Germany and France, and the loosening of the bonds of mutual obligation and respect among the members of the European Union. You know, I tried to claim that that could be, you know, patched up if we could get to a peace in Ukraine. I really thought that, you know, that part of the problem is this sort of open wound in Europe, and that if it was, you know, resolved, then maybe we could make an effort to restore. We Americans could show our traditional caring and interest about not propping up, that's not the right word, but reinforcing the European project, which is in our interest, fundamentally in the American interest to do. But to really expect Trump to do that is completely unreasonable. I mean, I don't think he has any interest whatsoever in that. So I'm afraid I think that even if Trump does manage to drive through some sort of a peaceful resolution in Ukraine, it's not going to halt these trends we're seeing in Europe. I don't see how it could. It's probably going to expose even more division. So I don't know what that says about the security of the continent and so on, because, you know, I don't really see how the United States can continue to be the guarantor of the security of Europe. I don't think Trump wants to do it, and I think other people who may follow him may also feel that Americans no longer have the luxury of doing all these, being the, you know, globally so have such a prominent role in assuring security on a global basis. So I think Europe will have to, you know, find a way to, you know, to assume more responsibility for their own defense.
Well, I mean, that, you know, it is possible over time, you know, incrementally, if, as you say, Molly, you can bring peace in Ukraine. But of course, the risk is that America will pull back, and, you know, impelled by this, as Matthias said, you know, coalition of the willing, which, to be honest, I mean, if you add up their, you know, economies and military forces, does not look particularly, you know, adequate or powerful. But rhetorically, at least, Europe will continue to push forward, and will get into a crisis that it basically cannot manage or control. I mean, I don't know how great that risk is, but it's certainly something that worries me. I mean, the other thing, of course, I don't know if you would agree, Matthias, but the problem about grand coalitions, or having, you know, all the parties of the center in one government, is that historically, especially in a context of economic crisis, that automatically tends to strengthen the extremes, because the extremes are the only opposition left. And I think we have seen that in France under Macron. Macron basically just united or inherited or, you know, took over the whole of the center. And what do you see? The rise of La France Insoumise on one flank and the Rassemblement National on the other, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen this in Austria, of course, right? The precursor of grand coalition after grand coalition is at some point, you know, the far right becomes the biggest. Doesn't necessarily mean they can actually form a government, but it does mean that, you know, voters are fed up, right? So the only way this can be successful, this kind of grand coalition, if it does have a real project, right? A project of, like, we are going to revitalize the German economy, and we're going to, I mean, basically start implementing some of the things that Mario Draghi's report is talking about, right? And that, I mean, so in many ways, to come back to Molly's point, she's absolutely right. Trump has zero interest in European integration, right? That said, his major gripes with Europe are a trade deficit, a huge trade deficit. 2, not enough defense spending, and 3, somehow he has it out for Germany, right? That's the one, the one country he wants to, you know, have suffered the most. And so the Draghi plan really would invest more in Europe, create more demand in Europe, basically balance the European economy away from completely relying on exports to the United States, which of course they do more and more as they've cut themselves off from Russia and they're de-risking from China, from the Chinese market. Increase in and more investment, joint investment in defense spending, which is something, and defense procurement, and so something Draghi also talked about, would help the Americans, in Ukraine supposedly. And then, joint debt is something the Germans don't want. So pushing them to do this would really piss them off, right? That's the theory. In theory, I can see a huge appeal for the Trump administration in pushing this. And they should fly to Munich, say peace in our transatlantic time, waive the Draghi report and say, you implement this. And then all Trump's problems are solved. But he's going to be much more interesting in doing bilateral deals with every single country, right? Fort Trump, Fort Ivanka, Fort Don Jr., whatever they can give. He wants to show American weapons deals. He wants to show more U.S. Military personnel helping and on these bases. He basically wants to withdraw Americans from Europe, right? I mean, that seems to be his goal. And let's be honest, if the Democrats don't get their act together in the next 4 years, and what we've seen in the last 2 weeks, we can doubt that they will. And you have a President Vance after this. I mean, Vance is a much more stronger believer in all of this. So yeah, I mean, I agree with Anatol. They need they can gradually do this, assuming there's peace in Ukraine, but it's just hard to see. I mean, in the end, at least a Harris presidency had the potential for Ukraine of a quick invitation for Ukraine, right? That's what some of the discussions, at least in DC, were based on, that if Harris would win, she would be able to kind of push the Germans into fast-tracking NATO accession for Ukraine. Then you can settle on whatever the current battle lines are, the lines of contact, but there would be a clear security guarantee for the rest of Ukraine, the Ukraine that Kiev controls. And NATO enlargement would come prior to EU enlargement. And, again, in theory, the playbook was written. That is gone, right? As a possibility. Like Ukraine membership of NATO for Ukraine is not going to happen in the next 5 years, or the next 10 for that matter. I mean, who knows, right? But so you're going to have to find, from a European, from an EU, from a UK point of view, how do you guarantee Ukrainian security if there is some sort of ceasefire or settlement, and that I'm not sure they're up for, right? Because then it becomes a whole different risk assessment, right? And then you cannot hide behind the Americans anymore, right?
Well, I mean, of course, the other prospect that has been held out, which would actually implicitly have a kind of security guarantees as well, certainly in terms of economic retaliation, is membership of the European Union for Ukraine. But I have to say, I mean, all the political and economic tendencies that we've been talking about, including pressure on budgets, are not, I think, encouraging when it comes to further expansion of the European Union. I don't know if that is how you see it, Matthias.
It has to be unanimous, right? That's the last vote has to be. I mean, if you think about all the veto players on the EU side, that can ruin this. But also think about all the things that we're expecting Ukraine to do. I mean, let's not be naive about it either. I forgot who said it, but if Ukraine were a member of the European Union today, it would be by far the most corrupt EU country, far beyond. Yeah, and the poor, far beyond. Hungary today, and we know how Orban has managed to seize EU funds and use it in all kinds of creative ways. But you'd have to reform the common agricultural policy. You'd have to reform the cohesion policy. I mean, you have to convince, and even the Poles, as enthusiastic as they are, at least the elites in Warsaw, of Ukraine joining, when it comes down to the small things like Ukrainian grain being sold in Poland, it becomes already a huge issue, right? So, I mean, honestly, it's not a silver bullet. It's also hard to see Ukraine joining the EU anytime soon. And with soon, I mean in the next 10 years, right? you could think of 2040, but how does that solve the current conflict now, right? And I think a lot of members, not least Ireland, Spain, are very uncomfortable with this idea that EU membership for a country at war then now implies something similar as Article 5 in NATO, right? That this means EU members are at a duty to come to the aid of the country, right? It's one thing to do this for a long-established member. It's quite another thing to kind of put the horse before the cart, right? And which is what the cart before the horse, which is what they would be doing.
Well, and speaking of horses, and in the context of farmers' demonstrations in London at the moment, French farmers who have quite a history of blocking roads would, I think, have something to say about reforming the common agricultural policy in ways that would simultaneously slash their subsidies and open their markets to Ukrainian food. Yeah, I mean, had several questions, Molly, basically asking, I mean, how much time does the European Union have to get its act together? And I mean, does it in fact have a future as a union? Or given everything that's happening, will it end up very likely as a much looser grouping of countries? What is your view on that?
Well, I think a precondition to Europe getting its act together and acting collectively, in particular in this defense sphere that I emphasize in my paper, that all of that I believe is conditional on there being some sort of a satisfactory resolution of the war in Ukraine. And so as we know, that is a tall order, but I guess the thing is that definitely Trump has been, very vocal about this being a priority. But in order to do this, I'm a former diplomat, so I'm just looking at this in terms of what that is. It's a very intricate process, because the only way that this could be done in a way that would be stable and could represent a true resolution would be to involve Europeans as well fully. And we're not off to a really good start, because it looks to me, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I'm not sure how much the Biden administration even consulted with Europe on the decision to allow these long-range missiles to be used. It seemed like Europeans appeared to be blindsided by that. So that isn't really a very hopeful sign. And of course, I realize that's the Biden administration, but the Trump administration, I imagine, would also have a predilection to acting unilaterally. And I think the way to make this work would be for some very skillful diplomat, which I guess is going to have to be Marco Rubio as the Secretary of State, to begin to hear from them, to see what they would accept, to see what approach that they would welcome, and of course getting the Ukrainians on board for something where they would feel that their fundamental interests were still, preserved in the settlement. All this is definitely some Nobel Peace Prizes would be available to people who made this work, but is it really realistic? So if this could happen, I believe the Europeans would be then freed to move to develop their own more autonomous defense capabilities, which of course means the industrial sphere as well. I don't think it's a long-term solution for Europeans simply to outsource their security, by buying American weaponry. They need to work on their defense industrial capability, which I know the French are always favored of that approach, and I think the Germans do too, really. So I think I still believe that a whole lot depends upon whether we can get stabilize the situation in Ukraine. Beyond that, I think there is a prospect for the European Union to survive and to prosper, although it might very well find itself having to roll back some of to redelegate perhaps more to the national governments a great deal, certain prerogatives that previously have been at the level of the Commission. And the
I
other
mean,
thing I'd say, I think, I don't know if I'm right or wrong about this, but I get the impression that Ursula von der Leyen is a strong leader, but she's sort of like the big oak tree that covers up and kind of smothers other people's, kind of roles and so on. In other words, that it seems to me the Commission as a whole is weaker and less, and there aren't any really strong personalities with real dynamism, because it's just, that's, so I don't think that's a healthy development.
and of course, the problem about European military spending is that you can't develop this quickly without either buying American weapons or really pooling European production. But if you're going to buy American weapons, that rules out using this as an economic stimulus, as it has acted, in the US. But of course, equally, trying to pool military production leads to furious fights among the Europeans themselves, basically about whose industries get benefited and whose are shut down. Matthias, an interesting question from the floor. This was brought home to me, by the way, in Georgia earlier this year, when a number of people pointed out to me that, our NATO neighbor is not France or Germany or Poland, it's Turkey. And so there's a question from the audience. Is there any chance of the European Union, collectively or individually, developing towards what William Burns has called the hedging middle, like so many countries in the world, including Turkey, which are, very much trying to pursue their own interests, while you could call it zigzagging between Washington, Moscow, and Beijing. Is that a possible future for the European Union? Are the Europeans capable of heading in that direction?
I mean, it's definitely a theoretical possibility, right? I mean, and a lot will depend on what Trump 47 administration does to Europe, right? I mean, if they start out by immediately raising tariffs to 10% on every single thing coming from Europe, then threaten to take it to 20%, then basically tell them you're on your own in Ukraine. We're going to try to make a peace deal. If Putin isn't interested, we're done. We're withdrawing our support. And then on top of them, tell them that they need to decouple from China. The Europeans are going to say, okay, forget it. No way, right? I mean, and so is there a possibility of US unilateral policy driving Europe in the arms of the Chinese? Yes, that's a possibility. That said, it's obviously hugely divided Europe on this issue. As we saw with the tariffs on electric vehicles, Spain and Germany tried desperately to stop them until the last minute, while France and Italy were perfectly happy with it. And let's not forget Eastern Europeans and Poland, the Baltics. I mean, these were all the countries. I mean, remember the days of 17 plus 1, where China had this privileged relationship with East and Central Europe, the Balkans, and so on. The ones that have soured the most on this, of course, are the Baltics, because they see Chinese support for Russia's war effort in Ukraine, and they don't like it one bit. That said, and Molly knows this as well as I do, given her expertise in Central and Eastern Europe is hugely dependent on Germany for their own economies, right? They're part of this kind of broader industrial complex, the whole supply chain. Yeah. And so Germany wants to hang on, not just selling stuff into the Chinese market, but also from Chinese investment in renewables and all these things, where they're actually further than the Europeans to some extent, that they want that technology transfer, and they want to catch up that way. So you cannot decouple from all three at the same time, right? I mean, was it Constanze Stelzenmüller's line of, you've outsourced your energy to Russia, your growth to China, and your security to the US? If everything goes, I mean, yeah, I think that the China bit is what they'll keep. What I find hard to see is somehow like a European interest emerging that's truly European, right? That would be the idea of European sovereignty, strategic autonomy, right? That the Europeans, all 27 of them, would agree on this is in our interest, right? I mean, it seems to me the Poles would rather have a nuclear weapon of their own than relying on Berlin and Paris for their security, right? So that's where I think they're not quite ready to give up on the US, right? They'd rather flatter, go down on their knees, do whatever Trump wants to keep that. And I think, to be fair, in the last few days, Trump people have already hinted at this, right? If you have a trade surplus or not a trade deficit with us, and you spent more than 3% on defense from GDP, then you're fine. So I think Latvia is fine. So
and that totally destroys the basis of the European Union. It's a customs union. You can't selectively trade with Latvia on a different basis than for anyone else. I mean, that really is really corrosive. I didn't know they'd said that. That's awful.
Yeah.
Molly, a question, or rather a remark from the floor, saying that the idea of military guarantees really hard guarantees to Ukraine is inherently empty because, after all, our governments have said and demonstrated again and again that they will not go to war to defend Ukraine. They will not send their own soldiers to defend Ukraine. European publics are strongly against it. And of course, the Trump administration, I suppose they could fall into a crisis, something could happen that would bring that about, but it's certainly not in any way part of their agenda. So, in fact, is all this talk of security guarantees for Ukraine just empty in the end?
Well, NATO membership, I would think, would be off the table, possibly permanently, in that my sense is that Russia has the upper hand militarily now and would probably pursue the war rather than acquiesce in the idea of any eventual NATO membership. But I do think that there might be another formula for security guarantees that I don't necessarily know whether they would satisfy the Ukrainians, that they were really solid enough. But I think that something like that is going to have to be part of the formula for peace. There's going to have to be some level of guarantee. And also, of course, that some people are suggesting that European troops or NATO nation troops would be stationed on this truce line or something like that as peacekeepers. That obviously is not something the Russians like very much, but some kind of security for stability for this, whatever this new boundary is, would have to be part of it as well. But probably more than I do about this, Anatole, and maybe Matthias as well, the military dimensions of this. So it's obviously a very difficult puzzle to solve, but I think just allowing the situation to slowly escalate is very, very dangerous. And it does, I think, continue to promote very unhealthy developments in Europe. Mm-hmm.
Well, yes, because there are more and more fears that the Ukrainian front might actually collapse, at which point one would be in a deep crisis with really severe dilemmas for the Europeans and America. I don't think that troops from NATO countries would be agreed to in any deal with Russia. But Russians have talked to me about the possibility of a substantial UN presence with large demilitarized zones, of course, on the Ukrainian side, not the Russian side, as they put it. There are possibilities out there, but in the end, of course, it has to be something that both sides will agree to. There's a question on the floor about a Putin-Trump agreement, resembling Munich and that as a prelude to further Russian aggression. I have to say, from what the Russians simply dismiss as absurd, the idea of a deliberate voluntary attack on NATO as it now exists. They point to what's happened militarily in Ukraine and the lack of Russian interest. But on the other hand, what they point to is the possibility, as in Ukraine, really, or in Georgia in 2008, of essentially a local crisis, and they point to Belarus there, then without planning on either side, dragging both sides into a conflict or confrontation. Now, to avoid that would take a degree of, serious forward thinking on the part of the European Union, NATO, European countries. Matthias, are we capable of that?
Of course we're capable of it, but are we willing, right? It just seems to me, yesterday or the day before was the first survey coming out of Ukraine where 52% now want to stop fighting, right? They want this to end and end as soon as possible, not like end under certain circumstances and so on. But I think that is something that many people, especially in Western Europe, in Belgium where I'm from, but places like Ireland that's traditionally neutral, Portugal, the further you get away from the conflict, they're like, honestly, why are we prioritizing this, right? Why is this so important? So that said, I think there is great enthusiasm amongst the European public for the EU to do more on defense, right? Actually, way more enthusiasm from the public. It's the elites that are the problem, right? The national elites that want to keep this similar, as you mentioned, Anatole, on military procurement, right? The tragedy of the EU is that it's not like Boeing or Lockheed Martin can say, look, we're having jobs in 48 of the 50 states, and here we have 96 senators every time we need more subsidies who will support this, right? It's much harder to do this in the European context because, again, you have to pick winners, and winners have to then be based in particular countries. And then is it, well, why Poland and not Spain, and why Germany and not France? And it's always going to be like this, especially from the countries that feel like they're paying in more into this, right? Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there may well be a lot of people in Europe that are relieved that Trump is the president, and hence that this policy of kind of like getting Ukraine closer to the West and making it your problem is going to go away. They may be naive thinking this, but I don't see a huge cohesion here, right? Even Macron says one thing, but he always says it in response to Scholz, right? And it's if those two don't think alike, yeah, we can talk all we want about how the center of gravity of Europe has shifted eastwards. And when it comes to defense, to some extent, that's true. But it's not true for everything else to do with European integration, right? Poland cannot claim to be a leader of the EU if it's not even in the Eurozone, right? And they have no desire to enter anytime soon. And they know absolutely why. So that's why, there's more reasons to be pessimistic than to be optimistic.
Yes, in Berlin, a member of a German think tank said that, as a result of the unreliability of France and the possibility of a Trump administration, Germany would have to base its security and security thinking on Poland and its alliance with Poland and the Baltic states. Now, of course, I am a certain age, and so most of my close friends in Germany are a certain age, but I ran this past the older generation of Germans, and they were not happy about German foreign and security policy being determined in Warsaw. Well, we are at the end. Perhaps just one final thought, Matthias. You mentioned that we're not looking at Ukrainian membership of the European Union within the next 10 years, or possibly even 2040. In 2040, given what's happening to the climate and what could happen to migration, it could be, of course, that European priorities have simply, and wider world priorities have simply changed, that we are living in a completely different world. And therefore that much of what we've been describing today is perhaps no longer relevant. I think, if you're looking at the kind of great historical patterns that underlie what we've been talking about today, I think it's worth, remembering that over a generation, an awful lot can change. But well, I don't know. I may have remarked about this before, made a date with a German friend to discuss Russia's achievement of liberal democracy and integration into the West. In the same cafe in Germany, we made this date for 100 years from now. We will see. Anyway, Molly, Matthias, thank you both so much. Fascinating discussion. Thanks to the audience. I'm sorry I couldn't get around to all of your questions. And I hope that many of you can attend our next 2 meetings. Thank you so much.